If the events you are describing did in fact occur on February 28, 2026, with a coordinated Israeli and American strike on Iran, followed by a large-scale Iranian retaliation against U.S. bases across the region, then the Middle East has entered one of the most dangerous strategic moments in modern history. A direct exchange between Iran and the United States, especially when Israel is openly involved, represents a fundamental shift away from the long-standing pattern of shadow warfare and calibrated escalation. What makes this moment historically significant is not simply the scale of the strikes, but the decision by all sides to cross thresholds that they had previously tried to avoid. For decades, Iran and Israel have been locked in a covert war fought through intelligence operations, cyber attacks, targeted assassinations, and proxy militias. The United States has intermittently struck Iranian-linked targets in Iraq and Syria, while Iran has backed armed groups that target American forces and Israeli interests. However, open, declared, direct military strikes between Iran and both Israel and the United States simultaneously represent an entirely different level of confrontation. If Washington and Tel Aviv jointly attacked Iranian territory, and Tehran responded by striking U.S. military bases in the Gulf, then deterrence theory in the region has shifted dramatically from indirect signaling to open force projection. Iran's retaliation, particularly if it directly targeted American bases in countries such as Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, or the United Arab Emirates, marks a decisive change in its strategic posture. Historically, Iran has relied heavily on deniability. It has preferred to respond through allied militias in Iraq, Hezbollah in Lebanon, or the Houthis in Yemen, allowing it to apply pressure without formally declaring war. A direct strike on U.S. bases, however, removes ambiguity. It signals that Iran is willing to absorb the political and military consequences of open confrontation in order to preserve credibility. The most immediate novelty in this retaliation lies in its directness. A direct missile barrage against American installations in the region is a calculated gamble. It carries enormous risk because it invites counter-retaliation from the most powerful military in the world. Yet from Tehran's perspective, failure to respond decisively could have been interpreted domestically and regionally as weakness. Iranian leadership has repeatedly stated that attacks on its sovereignty would be met with proportional or greater force. If this promise was publicly made and then fulfilled, the retaliation is not just military, but reputational. Iran is signaling that deterrence against it cannot be established cheaply. Beyond the direct strikes, the broader structure of Iranian strategy still rests on layered escalation. Even in a scenario where Tehran has fired ballistic missiles or long-range drones, it retains multiple secondary levers. Its network of allied non-state actors across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen remains intact. These groups provide strategic depth. Iran can intensify pressure on U.S. forces in Iraq, increase Hezbollah's operational readiness along the Israeli border, or encourage Houthi activity against regional maritime routes. The key point is that Iran's retaliation is unlikely to be a single event. It is part of a scalable escalation ladder. The impact on Arab states hosting American bases is particularly significant. If Iranian missiles landed in or near facilities inside Gulf countries, those states are now involuntary participants in a direct confrontation. Even if the strikes were limited strictly to military compounds, the political symbolism is immense. Governments in the Gulf have long attempted to balance security cooperation with the United States while maintaining channels with Tehran. A direct Iranian strike on their soil forces a recalibration. It raises the question of whether hosting American forces enhances deterrence or increases vulnerability. In Iraq, the situation is even more complex. Iraq has historically served as a battleground for U.S.-Iran competition. If escalation intensifies, Iraqi territory could once again become the primary arena for indirect confrontation. Iraqi militias aligned with Iran may view American retaliation as justification for renewed attacks. Baghdad's government would face severe internal pressure, torn between maintaining relations with Washington and preventing its territory from being consumed by regional war. Iraq's fragile political balance could deteriorate rapidly under such strain. Syria remains strategically central because it provides Iran with logistical corridors linking Tehran to Lebanon. Israeli airstrikes in Syria have been a regular feature of the regional landscape. In a high-intensity confrontation, Syria could become the primary channel through which Iran attempts to apply pressure on Israel without triggering immediate escalation on its own soil. Increased Israeli operations in Syria, in turn, risk drawing Russian attention, given Moscow's presence there, even if Russia seeks to avoid direct involvement. Lebanon stands at perhaps the most dangerous edge of the escalation spectrum. Hezbollah possesses a significant missile arsenal capable of striking deep into Israel. If Iran's direct retaliation is followed by broader confrontation, Hezbollah's involvement would transform a regional clash into a multi-front war for Israel. That would dramatically increase civilian vulnerability and international alarm. Lebanon's economic fragility makes it especially ill-equipped to absorb another major war. Yemen, while geographically more distant, remains strategically relevant due to maritime routes in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. If Houthi forces intensify operations against shipping in response to regional escalation, global trade and energy flows could be disrupted. This would internationalize the conflict economically, even if militarily it remains regionally concentrated. The broader meaning of Iran striking Arab territory hosting American forces lies in its redefinition of accountability. Tehran is effectively declaring that states enabling attacks on it are not neutral. This changes the rules of engagement. Gulf monarchies may now reassess the risks of deeper integration into U.S. defense architecture. At the same time, they may double down on missile defense and security cooperation, further militarizing the region. Iran's military capabilities are central to understanding the credibility of its retaliation. Over the past decade, Tehran has invested heavily in ballistic missile development and drone technology. These systems are designed to offset conventional weaknesses in air power. Iran's air force is comparatively outdated, but its missile inventory provides asymmetric deterrence. The use of precision-guided munitions, if demonstrated effectively, would reinforce the perception that Iran can reach strategic targets across the Gulf with relative accuracy. Psychological warfare is equally important. Even if material damage is limited, the demonstration that U.S. bases can be targeted undermines the perception of invulnerability. Deterrence is partly psychological. If regional populations witness incoming missiles crossing their skies, the sense of stability erodes. Insurance costs rise, markets react, and investors reassess exposure. Iran understands that strategic messaging amplifies the impact of each strike. The question of whether this escalation could evolve into a third world war depends on the involvement of other major powers. For a conflict to become global in scope, it would require direct engagement between great powers. While Russia and China maintain relations with Iran, neither benefits from direct military confrontation with the United States over the Middle East. Russia is already managing its own strategic burdens, and China prioritizes energy security and trade stability. Both would likely call for de-escalation rather than intervention. However, the risk of miscalculation cannot be dismissed. If U.S. casualties are significant, domestic political pressure in Washington could drive broader retaliation against Iranian infrastructure. If Iran perceives existential threat, it could expand the scope of its response dramatically. Escalation dynamics often unfold not because leaders desire total war, but because each side feels compelled to restore deterrence after each exchange. Energy markets are another destabilizing factor. The Strait of Hormuz remains one of the most critical choke points in global oil transport. If Iran were to threaten or disrupt traffic there, the economic consequences would extend far beyond the region. Such a move would likely trigger multinational naval responses, increasing the density of armed actors in a confined maritime space and raising the probability of accidental clashes. At its core, this confrontation reflects a deeper strategic struggle over regional order. Iran seeks recognition as a dominant regional power with security interests that must be respected. Israel seeks to prevent Iran from establishing military entrenchment and potential nuclear breakout capability. The United States seeks to maintain freedom of navigation, protect allies, and prevent hostile dominance of the Gulf. These objectives collide structurally, not just tactically. Despite the severity of the moment, history shows that even intense exchanges can be contained if both sides perceive the costs of escalation as exceeding the benefits. After prior limited confrontations, back-channel diplomacy often played a crucial role in preventing spiral dynamics. The key variable will be whether decision-makers prioritize symbolic victory or strategic stability. In realistic terms, a full global war remains unlikely, but a sustained regional war is entirely plausible if retaliatory cycles continue. The difference matters. A regional war would devastate economies, displace populations, and destabilize governments without necessarily drawing in NATO or Asian powers directly. A world war would require formal alliance mobilizations and cross-theater combat, which remains a high threshold. The coming days would determine whether this episode becomes a contained shock or the beginning of a protracted confrontation. Military signaling, diplomatic messaging, and restraint in target selection will all shape the trajectory. What is clear is that the old model of controlled proxy competition has been severely disrupted. Once states move from shadow conflict to overt missile exchanges, returning to ambiguity becomes far more difficult. If the retaliation has indeed fulfilled prior Iranian threats to strike American bases, then Tehran has chosen credibility over caution. Whether that decision strengthens its deterrence or accelerates escalation will depend on how Washington and its allies respond. The balance between demonstration of strength and avoidance of catastrophic war now defines the strategic crossroads facing the region.